All right, well, here it is, 2:45, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the NEMA conference, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we get the session started, we have a quick word from our fabulous sponsors at the Harvard Museum School, the Harvard Extension School Museum Studies Program. All right, thank you so much to the folks at the Museum Studies program at the Harvard University Extension School, and I will hand that over to Ruth and Morgan. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Ruth Taylor. I'm the Executive Director of the Newport Historical Society, and along with Morgan Grefe, who is the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Historical Society, we are here to talk to you about data. I should say going in, and when data surprises, but I should say going in a little bit that we are going to try to maximize the technology here to allow this session to be not just a presentation, but a little more of Q&A. So we're going to encourage you at various points to raise your hand, ask a question, respond to questions we raise, and hopefully we're going to be able to retrieve those questions and release you to ask them or answer them. I'm just going to share my screen now. So we're talking about, not just talking about data, but talking about when data surprises. So I will mostly be talking about the results of surveying in this session. And obviously we go into surveying looking to find out something about our audiences, right? We want to serve them better. We want to get to know them. And so we ask them questions. But sometimes it seems to me as we do this, what we learn is more about us and preconceptions that we may have had going in. And sometimes what we learn is really a shock. And it is upending to the idea that we know what we need to know to do our work. And I think the interesting question then becomes how we respond to that, whether we change our focus, whether we recognize it as an opportunity, or whether we just realize that we have not, in fact, been doing everything that we should. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Newport Historical Society. And this end of 2018 into 2019, we had some sense of where we were and what we were not doing well. And that the world was changing a little bit and the expectations for us were becoming different. So one assumption that we had is that our audiences were increasingly expecting us to take a stand on current issues. We also had a sense, we thought, that our public or the public does not think that history is particularly relevant and is potentially mistrustful of the telling of it. We had a sense about our own resources. Our Museum of Newport History, which if anyone has ever been to it, is tiny. It was installed in 1995. We were a little embarrassed of it, and we were beginning to embark on a pretty significant process of figuring out how to redefine it, how to make it bigger, maybe relocate, raise money. It was going to become the core activity that we embarked on. We assumed that tourists, we were in a tourist town in Newport, Rhode Island. We assumed that tourists were the core visitors for the museum. We assumed that our members were our core visitors, core constituency for lectures. And we were perennially being told that we needed to do more programming for families and children. And I will tell you that the Newport Historical Society has not made a specialty of programming for families or children, almost at all. So those were the concerns that were swirling around. We did or engaged with 2 survey projects in 2008 and 2018 and 19. We worked with Susie Wilkening of Wilkening Consulting on her inclusive history audience research. We were a participant in that, and that included both national data and data that was specific to our audience. And then we performed 2 smaller scale surveys of our lecture audiences and our museum attendees. So when the survey, the Wilkening survey data started to come back, one thing that was not surprising was that history museum audiences generally, and certainly our audience here, are older, educated, well-off, and white on the whole. I do want to say, though, that having said that, I'll just jump to our audiences in particular. Our audiences were almost 20% non-white. So, and were, I want to say, 30 or 40, between 30 and 40% younger than 50. So while this was a definite skew, and the conversation about are you reaching the audience you want to reach is a fair one, it's not the conversation that we're hoping to have today. And the audience itself was not so tremendously monolithic so as to invalidate any sense of caring about the data. So here are the things that were surprising. Twice as many women as men visit history museums generally, and this was also true for us. Less than 40% of our visitors come with children. Over 80% of our visitors say they come because, in fact, they want to learn. And many of our visitors have a deep appreciation of the relevance of examining history. I was surprised. I felt it upended some of our sense of, you know, folks don't understand history, they don't think it's important, they don't think it's relevant. They were way more sophisticated consumers of what we offered than we thought. And here are 4 things that were surprising about the attitudes they expressed about visiting history museums and our history museum in general. Almost 100% of our visitors said that history museums offer trustworthy information. Now, history museums have been sort of trumpeting this notion that we are among the most trusted entities in America today for 20 years when this data was first published. I'll have to confess that even a couple of years ago, I would suggest that those days were over and we were not. But here we go, almost 100%, high 90s% of visitors say that history museums offer trustworthy information. Almost 80% believe that events in the past affect today. A large percentage, 60 to 80%, depending on how you ask. And I do want to say that one of the things that Wilkening Consulting is very good at is asking the same question in slightly different ways, which can be super illuminating. But a good chunk of our visitors think that history should be told from multiple perspectives, including that of oppressed populations. another sort of data point about our visitors versus the national data. National data, the number of people who responded to the survey was about 3%. Our data, it was over 11%. So this was an engaged group of people. There's no getting away from that. 40% think museums should take positions on current or past events. I want to tell you, before we looked at the data, if we'd surveyed our staff, we would have gotten a very different number there. Since we've started to think about this data, that's changed a little bit as well. So our audiences and the national numbers track very much, but as I mentioned, well, we had a very high response to the survey rate. But I do want to talk about the 60% of our audiences who do not want us to take stands, as contrasted with the deep understanding that our audience seemed to have in getting a multi-perspective interpretation, in understanding that the past may affect the present, gosh, if the past affected the president, that they have a deep and sophisticated understanding, it seems, in the way they express themselves, and yet they don't want us to take stands. So my question to all of you is, what do you think this means? What does it mean that 60% of our audience don't want us to take a stand? And I don't know if no one has anything to say or if I'm just missing a technology cue, but I know Morgan will engage with the question, but she's given you all a chance to think about it and maybe answer.
And we are able to, if you raise your hand, we are able to allow you to talk, it appears. So if you do want to comment, please do raise your hand. For us, this is something that we talk about quite a bit here at the Rhode Island Historical Society, and a conversation I have a lot with Ruth in terms of not just this data about that came out of Newport, but about Wilkening, the Wilkening study in general, about the lower level of people and what she differentiates as frequent museum goers and newer audiences. So that's a way that we're starting to think about it. It looks like Mia Sachs has a question, so we're going to let her talk. There you go. You should be able to unmute yourself. Mia?
Mia, if you find that you can't speak, you can type your question into the session Q&A and we should be able to find it that way as well.
Sorry. I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, indeed.
No idea. Sorry.
We can hear
Hi.
you.
Oh, can you hear me now or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
No idea.
But she can't hear us.
So we're going to, it seems like when, while we can hear Mia, she cannot hear us. So we're going to mute again and try to circle back.
I'm also going to flip to the next slide, which is a sampling of the data of what our audience tell us they do want us to tell them. Which again, it sort of enhances and highlights this question a little bit. Obviously, 80% and up want to see multiple perspectives. They want a deeper understanding. They say even that they want to be challenged and to hear history that they don't know. Where you drop down considerably is when you get to the question that says, be a place of reconciliation. Because in fact, that would be encouraging the institution to take a stand on a contemporary issue. And here we go down to that 40%, which means 60% don't want to see us do that. Let me go on to talk a little bit about how staff responded to this data. And again, I am hoping that we can sort out these technical problems so that people can speak a little bit, because I will say flat out that I am really interested in what you all think. Is it our job to persuade our audiences to want us to do this? Was the question that came up. Is it in fact our responsibility to tell people that they needed to hear what we thought when they were telling us that in fact they did not want to hear that? And I don't know, Morgan, if you have an opinion on this.
I have an opinion on whether or not it is our job to bring people on. I think one of the things that we've been having many discussions about is, in fact, in the interpretive space, where you position that question of dialogue within interpretation, and even those who work in the field of dialogic interpretation, acknowledging the fact that there are multiple layers to this kind of dialogue. So how we work dialogue in, and how we recognize within the audience people's appetite for having more of a discussion or an engagement with a topic that might be getting more into the weeds about why something is happening, how research was done, and being very transparent about the process by which we develop those interpretations. And so that's really, some of the conversation that we're having is less about that taking a stand and more about how we show our work and how we show who's doing that work and why. So those are some of the things that we're hearing from our team over here.
The survey responders were asked to express in their own words their thoughts about interpretation, and they were asked if they knew what revisionist history was, and to comment on that as well. And here are some of the comments that I think, there were a lot of comments. Again, a sophisticated audience, they had a lot to say. But here we go again. You are talking about history interpretation, which must be neutral and as factual as possible, but admit if you don't have all the facts. If you do it another way, you will lose the trust of your audience. I have no interest in visiting a site that purports to be a general history site, but focuses only on injustices. And then this other statement, which is a little more nuanced, instead of a single point of view, it is the presentation of a wide range of reviews, but they must all be reasonably balanced without excessive judgmental interpretation. And my conclusion after reading these and many other comments was that for this audience, history museums are cherished for what our audiences think they are, relatively neutral presenters of facts. Now, it's easy for me to say, there's no such thing as neutral. It's easy for me to say that the facts I present today may be entirely different than the facts I present even tomorrow. But it's less easy for me to say, but I think no less important, that this trust, this near 100% trust in what they think we are, has some value to us as well. I'm going to pause again in case we want to try to
So within the chat, Ruth, there's a lot of folks who are chiming in, and so people are wondering, is it that people want to get the information and present that we present the information in the story and then let them decide on their own stand? So is it more that they want it to be a space where you can lay out what they view as a broad range of facts, and then you allow them the space to make up their own mind?
That is exactly what people are telling us they expect to see. They are saying, by virtue of the comments and associated information, that they are looking for us to lay out all perspectives, all facts, as best we can, and then allow them simply to make their own decisions.
Erin would like to know if you could expand on the idea of, depending on how you ask, does the phrasing of the question have any relation to political affiliation or anything else so specific?
I don't actually think, forgive me all, I just finally was able to access the chat, so I'm super excited now. I don't think that this had anything to do with political affiliation. I think this is, when you're asking people questions that they're not routinely in the habit of answering, often you can get a more complete answer by asking the same question in two slightly different ways. For example, a question like, would you prefer your museum to take a stand on contemporary issues? And someone might just say no. You might ask them a little later in the survey, do you think the museum might want to tell you how we think about this today? And it's almost the same thing, and the same person might answer yes. So there are words and phrases that people have a particular association with, or you're encouraging them to think about something in a new way. And sometimes literally during the course of a survey, especially a long survey like this, you can see people changing their minds as they think about the questions. So that is all I meant. I do not think that there was anything related to political affiliation, although there certainly may have been issues of bias that the questions were trying to get around.
Allison has asked, did they not want you to take a stand, or did they just not feel strongly that you should?
Some were emphatic about not wanting us to take a stand. Here's one comment that I couldn't bring myself to type, but I will say. When I go to Auschwitz, I don't need them to tell me it was bad. People literally they are not interested in my opinion. And they're not interested in the opinion of my curators. And again, this is 60%, not 100%, not 80%, 60%, a bit more than half do not want to come into a museum and be told what to think, or even to have it suggested that they should be thinking something. They want to make their own opinion. And I want to say, besides the politics of all this, this does tie into something else that we are seeing in our audiences generally, which is that they want to have a very personal experience. They want to have a concierge kind of experience where they are able to define their own tour, define their own interpretation in a way, and not be handheld, or even, they want docents that they can ask questions of, not ones that give them a tour. So this is a little bit tied to that very me-based sense of the experience.
It seems, Ruth, that there are many things you're seeing in the chat now that Patrick has chimed in about some of the work of the Old State House in Boston. Can you see that, or should I read it?
No, it'd be great if you read it.
Patrick says, we found with our play Blood on the Snow at the Old State House in Boston in 2016 and 17, that link between past and present changed based on current circumstances. In the first year, the post-show discussion centered around Ferguson and the use of violence by police. In 2017, it was about the election and information of fake news. So thinking about your point there about that early on in the survey about whether or not it should connect to that folks are seeing the connection between the past and the present. And so how does that factor in? Have you seen that kind of thing?
I think that some of our audiences are a bit of two minds. I want to say we did follow up a little bit with one-on-one conversations with some of the people who I could identify from their survey comments, and so was able to reach out to them. I think that people are a little of two minds. They recognize that there is a connection between the past and the present, and they recognize that sometimes outlining that connection, and somebody asked in the oh, this is also Patrick, when you start introducing previously ignored perspectives, do people perceive this as a statement of judgment? And the answer to that is, I think, a little bit of yes. This is the removal of privilege feels like persecution, right? When you are no longer the center of the picture, it feels critical. So there's definitely a hint of that as well in all of this. And someone else has asked the question, has made the suggestion when you think about the major demographic of attendees, and this is Erin, it isn't surprising if you ask younger audiences, you would get a wholehearted yes. I am not so sure. And I think that's a really fair question and one that deserves some drilling down. I did mention at the beginning that I think if you'd surveyed my staff, they would have said a wholehearted yes, because they assumed that that's what our audiences want from us. Now that they know it's a more complicated question, they're a little less wholehearted. And I find that interesting as well. Yes, I do think, Mia, the desire not to be told how to think or to be guided in your opinions poses problems or considerations regarding best practices and exhibit creation. I do. I think sometimes that the field evolves in a direction of best practice that is the bridge between the field and the audience needs to be a little more updated in real time than it is to some degree, because you're right that we are being encouraged in our interpretation, with the exception of the dialogic interpretation movement, but we are being encouraged to shape an experience for our visitors. And what we are maybe learning a little bit, at least from some history museum visitors, is that they don't want that defined, shaped experience. I think there is a bit of a conflict there. These are really juicy comments. I am going to start to move ahead a little bit. Hopefully we'll leave a time at the end to talk a little bit about wrapping up. This is a less fraught part of the presentation in a way, but we also did these two smaller studies. We surveyed our museum visitors, only about 100 of them pre-pandemic, and we surveyed our lecture attendees. And if you remember at the beginning, I said that we were getting ready to redo our home museum. We were going to deinstall it. And what we learned, and this is not completely unrelated to the previous information, was that of the 100 people, 99 considered the museum very good or excellent. Even those who said things like, there should be more about slavery and the slave trade, or there should be a video. Now, this is a small sample. I think this is suggestive and not definitive, but let me say that I did not deinstall the museum last winter. And I have changed the way we're thinking, not just for pandemic reasons, but for this as well. Changed the way I'm thinking about how we present. We also learned that 50% of the visitors to the museum were from Rhode Island, that in fact we were 50-50 split between tourists and basically locals, and that was a big surprise as well. And interestingly enough, in the survey of lecture attendees, again, about 100 people sampled, only 50% were members. And of the other 50%, had no interest in joining. It was a very brief survey. It said, are you a member? Yes, no. If no, would you be interested in joining? So 50-50 members, not members, and of the not members, pretty much 100% said they had no interest in joining. In fact, someone said, hell no, but I enjoyed the lecture. So there's, as we think about going forward, one of the big things this has meant to me is that our notions of what audiences want and need, our notions of, sort of what we learn from, in fact, best practice, should not be the whole story. That this bridge between how we think about ourselves and what our audiences want from us needs to be almost a continuous feedback loop. And that is more and more important as the world is changing as fast as it is. No, our membership is not that expensive. I think it has everything to do, this is a question from Erin, is membership expensive? Curious as to why someone would respond so strongly. Our lecture, we chose a lecture that actually had a substantially younger audience than our usual. My sense is folks have no interest in joining a society. These folks, no interest. Interest in coming to a lecture if the topic interests them, no interest in being a member in that traditional sense. And we have, in fact, started talking about our membership in a different way than we did in the past. We are now suggesting that you're subscribing to Newport's history when you join us, as opposed to joining a club with all the kind of stuffy and overly related connotations of that. All right, well, I'm going to pass the baton to Morgan, and I'm going to start taking a closer look at the chat while I listen to her speak. And hopefully we'll have some time at the end to get back to some of these other questions.
Good evening, good afternoon. I'm just rushing this day, I suppose. As Ruth said, I'm Morgan Grefe, and I'm the executive director at the Rhode Island Historical Society, so across the bridge and up the road from Ruth. One of the things before I get started in this portion, I wanted to address one of Liz Shapiro had a couple of comments about that issue of taking a stand, and says at Old Newgate Prison, we encourage people to take action after they visited the sites. And I just wanted to point to some of Susie Wilkening's data around museums and neutrality, and that issue of Newgate, and thinking more about a site like Eastern State Penitentiary as well, where when they asked, people were more comfortable with museums taking stances if they were missions based. And so sites in particular, now I will back this up for those of you who don't know me and say that my expertise is prison museums and prison historic sites. So their point was, if it is clearly related to the mission and content of that organization, people are more comfortable with the taking of a stance. So that is just a slight twist on how we often think about whether or not museums should take a stand with the data that's coming out now in 2020. So just wanted to, if you haven't taken a peek at that data story from Susie, it's worth taking a look at. So today I'll be talking about some numbers as well, data from different kinds of studies, surveys, and materials that we have looked at over the last several years. My data is not, I think, particularly shocking in the same ways as Ruth, so I apologize for it not perhaps being as contentious or juicy, but I hope that it's also interesting in terms of the fact that it's also looking at what it is that we think we know about ourselves and our communities. So first we'll be looking at things that we learned about ourselves from member surveys. Then we're going to look a little bit more closely at what we learned about our own sites by looking at visitor data. Then digging into the history and heritage ecosystem that we exist in Rhode Island, and still finding that looking into that field yields more questions than answers. And then lastly, looking in on some surprising information when we looked at one particular audience, and that was our educational audiences, teachers and students. I apologize in advance. Comments are really challenging. It keeps telling me we have 0 comments. And so, so I keep having to try to find them. So I apologize if I'm not getting to them quickly enough, but we will find a way. So as said here, beginning in 2012, we started doing these visitor surveys that many of our organizations do on a fairly regular basis, checking in with folks who have already identified as having a particular interest and support of our organization. So clearly that's already a limited group. And so we wanted to understand a little bit our perception of our sites. We were going through a rebranding exercise. But it was very helpful for us. It was really the first time in more than a decade that we had taken a look at what our members and closest supporters felt. So we went in, as we all do, whether we want to or not, with some assumptions. They love our research center, our library. They love our concerts under the elms, or now with resurgence of Dutch elm disease, we call it our concert under the elm, which is just a little sad. And that they could care less about our peer-reviewed scholarly publication, Rhode Island History. And that was based on anecdotes. That was based on people saying, like, what, can I not get the journal? Could you not send that to me? I have 4,000 of my father's old journals. Do you take them back? And so it was based on conversations that we had had with our many members. So we were quite curious as we began to move forward about what we would find out. And what we found out was that if you look at scores of 4 or 5, overwhelmingly of 5s, 63%, the highest benefit of membership in our organization was that scholarly journal. If you looked at them as 4s and 5s, it's 86%. And I will say that this data was 2012, 2014, and 2018 supported that consistently. So we know that that has in fact stayed the same. And so the winnowing down of that journal over years, thinking people weren't interested in it, was actually then met with data that told us quite the opposite. And so our concerts for our members was only cited by 37% as being a priority, even a 4 or a 5. And so that helped us understand our concerts differently, not just as member benefits, but as fundraising opportunities for a broader community and also for sponsorships. So what that data did was just allow us not to get rid of a program, but to rather see it as a different kind of vehicle. So looking at this information and then running this data alongside what we like to think of as a mission versus margin exercise, right? So whatever we do has to either be, you know, along one axis of mission and one axis of margin, of bringing in dollars. And so we needed to see where these different programs really fit. And we learned that the journal, not surprisingly, was high on mission, but we didn't realize how important it really was. But what surprised us perhaps the most was that our members ranked our educational programs as of least importance. This was very surprising considering we have a standalone education center, and the backbone of a lot of our work was in the development of teacher professional development and curriculum development. And yet our membership was apparently not particularly interested in that. And so we had to start thinking a little bit differently about how we conceive of that and how we share that message of our educational initiatives. So did our membership even know what the extent of our educational work was? Because few of them were teachers. Not many of them were deeply engaged with school-age children at that point, according to kind of various age groups information in our data. And so is it that they don't view education as important, or even though they're members, were we not doing a good enough job communicating to them about the educational crisis in our state and the work that so much of our team was doing? And so it was extremely eye-opening for us. And we'll say that while Rhode Island history has remained at the top of the list for member benefits, Now education is listed as the second most important thing and almost tied with Rhode Island history. So by spending that time, again, educating our members about the work that we do, they've come around and now have rethought about their support of our education initiatives and the needs of our education communities. So we also had an opportunity to think more about our own museums. So some of you know we have a wonderful museum in Woonsocket, Rhode Island called the Museum of Work and Culture, which is dedicated to the story of labor and immigration. We do that through the lens of French Canadian immigration, but it expands out into 20th and 21st century immigration as well. And when I came on board, I would say there was sort of a sense that, yeah, you know, it's a cute place. They do some good hands-on things, but it's not really integral or central to what we do the way that the research center is. You know, we are a scholarly organization, and this is what we do. And so when we started then looking at and participating in data arts and the Cultural Data Project, we started looking at the visitation and realizing that of our multiple programs at 4 sites, the Museum of Work and Culture has and comprises 50% of our overall visitation. So combining the John Brown House Museum, all of our lectures, all of our concerts, all of our research visitation is only equal together to the Museum of Work and Culture. So clearly it was not this sort of second-class organization. It was a hub of what we do. It has the highest amounts of repeat visitation, and it has high levels of program attendance, and the highest level of repeat program attendance of any of our sites or programs. I see that Mia is chiming in and asking about feedback from guides and interactions with visitors and how reliable has that been compared to survey results. So we do gather anecdotal information from our visitors, but we also have visitor surveys that get sent out to all people who visit our museums, especially the Museum of Work and Culture has been doing this for a number of years now. And so we are seeing you know, the same sort of support for the work that goes on at this museum as being of fundamental importance. And I would say supporting as well the same kind of ideas that Ruth is saying she's seeing in her surveys. And so that really, finding out about the kind of central nature of the Museum of Work and Culture to the Rhode Island Historical Society was very helpful for us in thinking about how we do our programming, where we do it, and understanding that this is also an entirely physically accessible and ADA accessible site. And so pivoting our organization to focus also our work and using that as a sort of laboratory space where we've invested heavily in issues of accessibility for all physical abilities, visual impairment, hearing impairment, autism, and other forms of physical special needs, because we can do that here so much more easily and comfortably than we can in some of the other historic structures that we have in Providence. And so instead of saying, we need to really bring that professional spirit of Providence up to Woonsocket, we realize that we can actually learn much more about how to be an engaged community center by looking to the museum. I keep trying to go back and ask. We'll get back, I think, to Mia's question about on the ground visitation. I'd like to revisit that when we get through.
Ditto.
One of the other pieces that was most surprising, now, I don't know how many of you have been to Woonsocket, Rhode Island, if it's a big vacation destination for all of you, but it is not necessarily considered alongside of Newport in terms of visitation, even in Rhode Island. And yet, even in the year with the pandemic, this is our visitation for the fiscal year of 2020, but ending in March, so ending when the museum had to shut down. That people who came to the Museum of Work and Culture were from 34 states and 12 nations. In a typical year, we average 49 states and up to 20 nations coming to this small museum about immigration and labor in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. And those numbers, Ruth, they compare pretty favorably for you guys, right?
Yeah, and we are in, an international tourist town. Morgan, you have a question here from Gail about, and this makes it clear that it's not 100%, how much of the visitation at Museum of Work and Culture is school groups?
Oh, school group visitation is about 25%.
Which is not what you'd expect either.
No, this year, and I will get to that as we move forward a little bit, but I would say this year we created, like many of you, hit the ground running with more distance learning materials. And Museum of Work and Culture was pretty quick out of the gate with some turnkey Google Classrooms. And so we ended up increasing our student engagement since the pandemic by 250%. One of the issues, which I will talk about a bit more later, is that 50% of schools in Rhode Island, even before the pandemic, had a field trip moratorium. And so the ways in which we engage with schools have been pretty compromised over the last handful of years. But no, in reality, we do have a lot of adult and a lot of group visitation to the museum. And we have a lot of, as well, adult groups with special needs as well. So these numbers here for the Museum of Work and Culture, we actually have better international visitation at the Museum of Work and Culture than we do at the John Brown House, which is in Providence. And also some of that has to do with the nature of our programming at the museum being very deeply tied to French ancestry and heritage. The museum is exhibit is translated into French, and that was supported by the United Nations. And so the work that we do there is very much tied to other Francophone centers across the world. So another area that we focused in on was that ecosystem in which we exist, this history and heritage space. It probably won't be surprising to many of you to find out that history museums are some of the most common when we look at the overall number of museums in America. About 50% of them relate to history and heritage in some way. So we began in 2012 a study funded by Mellon looking into the history and heritage sector in Rhode Island. And one of the fascinating things that we found out right away was, okay, we've got to count all of these. So what does that look like? And we found out that in Rhode Island, there were and are 464 history organizations in the state of Rhode Island. 93% of them hold archival material, 83% have AV material, and 77% have artifacts. And 61% of them have budgets under $100,000.
That's pretty shocking.
So this was a surprising amount of organizations, and also their size did not in any way correlate with the quality of work that was going on within them. There are some of the smaller sites that have found niche audiences and programs and do absolutely extraordinary work. When we asked them how many have paying memberships, 60% of them said that they have paying memberships, but the majority of them don't know who their members are because they do not track them. So they allow people to buy memberships almost as a form of support, but they're not then tracked and treated as members. And so that ongoing question of, is membership just a different form of an annual fund? And when we went into this survey, a lot of it was about the collections aspect of this work. So if all of this is out here, how are they being housed? Are they cataloged? Are they, what are in these holdings? We, like many of you, work with libraries across our state, and our libraries work together really closely in terms of who has what. And we just don't know that in terms of who's collecting what. And so we started getting notifications a number of years ago, like, I think we're going to close, we're going to have a yard sale of our collections. And we realized in this question of, so what is the role for us to play as the statewide history organization when there are 463 other history organizations? And one of them could be that helpmate in understanding things like, we're having this challenge, who can you connect us with? And so we ended up creating Rhode, which is a directory, but then also creating a series of Rhode conversations, as they're called now, which are sort of professional development training sessions that actually highlight the incredible staff and consultants from other sites and consultants that are in our community, and highlights their work, and they become the teachers of their peer institutions. And so Patrick is chiming in saying that it's the highest number of history organizations per square mile. You know, I had thought so. And then I'm from the Philadelphia area, and I was down there and found out that Philadelphia County has 500 history organizations. So granted, Pennsylvania is pretty big, but Philadelphia has certainly given us a real run for our money.
As always.
So the other piece I want to talk about now is to go in a little bit more detail about one aspect of our audience, which is a big part of what we do, and that is the education space. One of the reasons we started working on the Rhode project was actually because of NEMA and a project we participated in called Sustain Your Mission, Save Your Collection, and realized when we were working with other organizations around the state that many of them were basing their programs on conceptions of what education was like from 20 and 30 years ago. And one of the most common misconceptions in Rhode Island was that that meant fourth graders. We just want fourth graders. Everybody you talk to was like, we just need to get the fourth graders because that's when you do Rhode Island history. And that has not been the case since the 1990s, in fact. And so to set the stage a little bit here in our land of history organizations, we also have 39 separate municipalities. We have no statewide curriculum. We have no social studies standards. We have no social studies staff at the Department of Education. And each local education agency gets to decide how social studies are taught in their community. So that would seem tough because it would seem like when you're looking at statistics, we would have 39 different local education agencies. And sadly, that isn't the case at all. In the little state of Rhode Island, because as my friend Ruth says, we don't aggregate well, we have, in fact, 66 local education associations deciding when and what to teach in the social studies. So in fact, we have to work with each different district. This is true for the state of New Jersey as well. New Jersey does not have, each county in New Jersey gets to decide on their own curriculum and standards as well. And so we have to figure out how it is, if we can't come up with one way of working with schools and students, how do we in fact spend our time developing resources that can most easily be used when there are 66 different variations, which we have to think about all the time. And so one of the ways that we started doing that was by creating teacher advisory groups and doing teacher surveys and teacher focus groups. And so we have a number of advisory boards and focus groups in these areas. And with the teacher focus groups, that helped us develop our online history textbook. And so they ranked and decided on what topics and modules they wanted and in what order. And one of the questions that came up was, okay, so 50% have field trip moratoria. And even those that don't have a very hard time paying for busing. So we make our field trips free, we create a bus fund. They still can't come because they are so taxed doing any number of other things on a daily and weekly basis. So we started surveying school districts on the amount of time that teachers have to teach the social studies. And if you listened in on the sessions this morning, in particular the wonderful education session out of Connecticut, they talked about the fact that a lot of the distance learning in particular is really K through 6. And when we worked with our elementary teachers, in particular in a very, what's considered a very good school district in Rhode Island, we had them work out and track over a number of marking periods how much time they have to devote to the social studies, not just history, but the social studies on a weekly basis. And that is a grand total of 11 minutes a week. So if our teachers have 11 minutes a week to teach social studies of any kind, how do we create materials that in reality they can use? And how can we help connect them with their local resources? And so there are many answers for this, and we do this in a number of ways. But really it's to look at it for today of saying, our data comes from many places. And we have to go in with loosely held assumptions about what it is that we expect to get out of that data, and be open to the idea that our ideas might be very wrong.
Well, and that our data may present for us opportunities to literally rethink the way we express our mission. And I think, both of us have had that experience over the past couple of years, even absent the pandemic, which certainly was data of the sort.
I just want to jump in while there's a pause to say we've got 5 minutes left in today's session, and I wish we had like 55 because I'm totally fascinated, but just heads up because there are, yeah.
There was a question asked early on that I don't have an answer to, but I think it's a great question, which is, in essence, what does taking a stand mean? And I'm going to guess that that's a question that, as much as I might have difficulty answering it, so would most of our surveyed folks. And I think that is an important thing for us to think about. And I'm also interested in, and I guess it was Mia's question about when your anecdotal evidence is contradicted by your survey, what do you do about that? And again, I don't have a grand answer to that either. But we've certainly both had that experience going forward. And I will say that the impulse to throw out the survey data is probably a poor one, but beyond that, I don't have a full answer for that either.
Erin had a question about, how clearly there's a goldmine of information here with data. So why is it that history museums and maybe other museums as well don't really prioritize evaluation? And so I would say, within the education sector that I come out of, certainly education evaluation is big business and was crucial to the work that we did. I can say anecdotally, what I've seen in the conversations that we've had is, for some it's money, the cost of evaluation. When you go to outside consultants, others have been, we'd love to design our own evaluation, but realizing that there's sort of an art to those things. So people looking for more training. So I would say that there is an appetite, I think, for training in how to structure meaningful evaluation. Because, and this is something we talk a lot about, and that is simply because we can measure it doesn't mean it's telling us something meaningful. And so often evaluation takes the form of being something that's kind of perfunctory and not necessarily telling us something that's meaningful. And so how you structure a question, and that's, I think, where people like Susie come in, because their whole, and the work that Colleen was talking about this morning, that's all they do. And so I would say that creating these data banks of even of the questions would be a great resource. I'd say the other thing is the time it takes. People, there's expectations to get things moving, and they don't want to slow down to think about how we're going to evaluate.
I also think there's a tremendous psychological impediment in that we don't want to get derailed. And, I feel like all of our survey projects have derailed us. So I'm less maybe afraid of that now, having experienced it a few times. But I think when I talk to colleagues about this, there is a concern that the data will, in fact, take you someplace you may not be prepared to go. I also want to say something about consulting, working with consultants to do surveying and evaluation. Like all other consulting relationships, it works best when you work with someone who doesn't come in with a survey and a can, impose it on your people, whoever they are, and then tell you the answer. It works best when you have someone who proposes a survey to which you get to respond and who works with you on how to deploy it as well. And there are a lot of people out there doing the less appealing practice.
There was a question that Mia asked about evaluations of experiences from the children's student visitor themselves. We have worked with evaluators, a woman named Ann Christner, in fact, who did work quite a bit with developing student evaluations, even for very young students that would involve drawings. And so we do work with teachers to gather student feedback. There's some degree of protection that teachers apply to that. So you often have to work through the school or the teacher to be able to then talk to or survey the students, but it is certainly meaningful and important, I think, important work to do. And then the other way we've done it with teenagers is the creation of teen advisory boards so that we have feedback sessions and develop relationships with teens in our community.
Meg, we are officially out of time. There were so many great questions and comments. I do hope this is all being captured so that we can get on with it a little bit more going forward.
Absolutely. Everything's being recorded. People can come back to this session after conference ends for up to 3 more months. And we encourage you to continue the conversation in a meetup room later on this week, or go ahead and continue the conversation online using the hashtag NEMA 2020 on Twitter. Thank you all so much. This has been a great session.
I want to just say too, I think Morgan would feel the same. Neither one of us would mind at all offline conversations. Reach out to us if you wish.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
Bye, Meg. Bye, everyone.